Well, the Tower of Babel is an unusual enough account, and we look at it and wonder what in the world's going on here. But also it's very interesting because it comes right at the end of the first section of Genesis, and the movement from Genesis 1 through 11 to 12 through 50 is a very interesting one because we have very different material that we find there. So let's look at each one of those briefly. The story itself, very important to understand that the tower that the people are building is a ziggurat. Ziggurats were well known in this period, in this part of the world, and so we have to understand what a ziggurat's all about. A ziggurat is not something that's a temple itself, but it is considered sacred space. Lots of times when people have talked about or thought about the ziggurats in the tower, they've thought that people were trying to get up to God. But once we understand about ziggurats, we find that that's not the case at all. Ziggurats were not for people to go up. They were built for God to come down. What's happening here is that in Genesis 3, people were driven out of sacred space. The Garden of Eden was sacred space, like a temple. And people were driven out of that sacred space. And in so doing, they lost access to the presence of God. In Genesis chapter 11 with the Tower of Babel, they are trying to reestablish God's presence among them. And so they have a temple that typically is located right near the foot of the tower that they build, the ziggurat. And they build the ziggurat for God to come down. It's a convenience that they provide for him. He's supposed to come down the steps, go into his temple to be worshipped. And so in that sense, they're trying to reestablish God's presence. But they're doing it on their terms, not his terms. Notice even that the text says that they wanted to make a name for themselves. Usually we think of that they wanted to make a name for themselves instead of letting God make a name for them. But it's not quite that. They wanted to make a name for themselves rather than making a name for God. After all, a temple should be making a name for God, not for the people. And so they were looking at themselves and having themselves as the focus rather than God as they built this temple and tried to reestablish his presence. So the idea was then that they were bringing God down to come into his temple, to be worshipped so that they could have his presence among them. Now, God was displeased. God did indeed come down, verse 5 tells us, but God was displeased because this was on their terms and it was for their recognition, not for his own. And so he disperses the people. Now, how's that work in transitioning to chapter 12? Chapter 12 begins the story of Abraham and the covenant. In Abraham and the covenant, what's happening is God is taking his own initiative to reestablish his presence among his people. And the covenant is the first step in that, because God is going to make himself known through Abraham and his family, and all the world will be blessed because God is making himself known through Abraham and his family. And then it's through Abraham and his family that God's presence will be restored, first in the tabernacle, then the temple, and eventually in Jesus Christ. And so we find that the transition across between the Tower of Babel and Abraham is based on the idea of God's presence. The Tower of Babel was man's own initiative. In the covenant, it was God's initiative to reestablish his presence.